Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you all for coming. This is exciting. This is like a huge turnout. I think this is like maybe a record for the members series this year. Yeah. Well done. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. This is I don't remember which week we are in the term, but maybe 5 or 6 for member series. It doesn't matter. Yeah. But yeah, thanks all for coming out. Tonight we have Adriana DiSilvestro. Did I say that right? Yeah. Who's a second-year master's student in the Department of Geography here. And I will turn it over to Adriana, but if you want to join in and ask questions for those who are online, remember to do it at slido.com. Just punch in that code or go to that QR link, and we'll be monitoring the chat. And then at the end of the talk, we'll be using the mic to pass around so that everybody can hear. Yeah, okay. Cool. Go for it. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, just a quick aside. That is not fully visible on the slider, so I wonder if we can actually pull the screen further down.
Oh, I don't know.
Maybe to your left over there? Is there a way to make the screen go further down?
I don't think so. Oh, we're good? Cool. Sorry, my various family members are trying to tell me that there's no audio. But it's because I didn't have my mic on. Okay. I feel like we should be good now. Okay, sweet. Conserving extraction, here we go. So before I get into things, this picture was taken by one of my collaborators, Bruce Muir, who is a land manager for the West Moberly First Nations up in the Peace region. And so these are fracking flares in BC in the Peace River region. They look to me, upon first glance, like wildfires, and obviously the two things are connected. But a pretty striking image to start us off here. Make sure the audio is working. Great. Okay. So this is inspired by an intro slide that Pedro had in his presentation that I really loved. So I wanted to do one too. Hi, I'm Adriana. I hope most of you know that by now. Like Steve said, I'm a second-year master's student in the geography department, where I conduct research largely within the realm of human environment geography, and I'll get to what that means in a little bit. So this is me. Here I am in the middle with my family's dog, Maisie. And then on the right here is a picture taken in Narragansett, Rhode Island, which is about 20 minutes from where I grew up. And on the left is a picture of Granville, Vermont, which is where I spend the vast majority of my weekends when I am home. Both places are really near and dear to me. And various sorts of environmental issues and resource use dynamics in these places have inspired the way that I approach my own work now. Yeah, so then in the bottom corner, we have my family's other dog, Mr. Squid, because I felt bad leaving him out. Okay, great. So I'm going to cover a good amount of ground today. My primary aim is to share with you some of the findings of a study that I conducted this past fall on the linkages between caribou declines in BC and fossil fuel subsidies. And then what I'm going to do is connect that project to my current master's research, my thesis research, on the provincial wolf cull here in BC, which it's had a lot of media coverage. Some of you may be familiar with that. Before I do any of that, I'm going to super briefly just kind of lay out the general theoretical approach of my work, because I think that helps sort of bolster understanding of some of the issues I'm going to talk about. So, like I said before, I am a human environment geographer. That means a lot of different things to different people. Geography in general means a lot of different things to different people. A really sort of well-known quote in the discipline is that geography is what geographers do. I can tell you from experience that saying that to confused undergrads who come to your office hours is not a great introduction to the discipline as a whole. But anyway, yeah, so this could be a whole separate lecture, but what's really important for you to know is that I'm interested in how human-environment interaction unfolds over space, place, and time. If you want to hear about the differences between space and place, you should sit next to me at dinner, or not, if you don't want to hear about that. So my work particularly is really concerned with this unfolding, but how it happens with biodiversity conservation and loss. So that's sort of my specific niche within it. But also as a human environment geographer, I identify really closely with a theoretical approach to environmental degradation known as political ecology. So this is also sort of something that's difficult to grasp as a tangible, concrete approach. But the simplest way to explain it is that in my theoretical tradition, environmental problems are not simply seen as being driven by human self-interest, right? So you have that kind of classic tragedy of the commons narrative. The fish are all gone because fishermen are selfish and they want resources and everyone takes too many. Political ecology sort of accepts that narrative, but then says, okay, there's no more fish. What are the external sort of political, social, and economic factors that have played into how people use resources? So in other words, environmental problems do not exist in a vacuum. They are contained in much wider webs of, historical, economic, social forces. I'm really concerned with how environmental problems exist in larger political, economic contexts, which we'll get to. Okay. This is a caribou. I just wanted to get that out there. Yeah, I honestly didn't exactly know what a caribou was until I got to BC. I was not planning to do my research on this. I actually had previously done research in Tanzania and was planning on continuing that. A variety of things happened, and now I'm very happily doing this sort of work. So caribou are otherwise known as reindeer outside of North America, which contributed to some confusion on my part for a bit. But yeah, they're really incredible just as sort of as an animal. a little bit like moose, but also very different. They have these huge hooves to walk on super deep snowpack. They only, at least this kind of caribou, a woodland caribou, they only eat sort of arboreal lichens that grow from trees, which is an issue that we'll get to. But yeah, really amazing. And perhaps most importantly, they're really, really central to a lot of First Nations here in BC. Historically as food, now that there's not many of them left, I've been told that the way to kind of frame their importance to these First Nations is as cultural sustenance, right? So not so much a food source anymore, but really a way of maintaining a connection to different kinds of ancestry and heritage. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. It's when you're like really deep in something, it's a little bit hard to understand how mainstream it might be in terms of like media consumption, but BC's caribou are really in a bad way. So numbers have plummeted from 40,000 to 15,000 over the past 3 decades. This is a far cry from various historical accounts I've read. I was reading a book that talked about them in the early 1900s and described them as bugs on a landscape. So we're really seeing some pretty intense declines. And while 15K might seem like a lot, that seems like a lot of individuals, the vast majority of these 15K, as we'll see in the next slide, are in the northern region. That is still fairly insulated from a lot of different forms of human activity, resource extraction, that kind of thing. Yeah. Nope. Okay. Yeah, so this map from the BC government does a pretty good job of showing exactly where these declines are happening. You can see here, the population labeling is kind of a whole mess, but this chunk is called the Southern Mountain population subgroup. And as you can see, 7 herds in there have been extirpated, which is a fancy word for locally extinct. They no longer exist. Another 7 are very clearly headed that way. Populations include numbers here like 6 or 4. So the Southern Mountain, really not in a great way, and neither is the boreal group up here. So just in general, the picture for woodland caribou here in BC is pretty bleak. Things are not looking up. So it's pretty unanimous amongst the scientific community, the wildlife management community, First Nations groups, that the primary driver of these declines is industrial development. So caribou populations are falling as a direct result of industrial development. So namely, forestry and oil and gas development. Forestry is a whole nother story. My research talks about oil and gas, which is what I'm going to continue with here. So that being said, this brings me to the project that I did this past fall, which this is sort of the cover for it. A few of you have said that you didn't see me much last fall, and I was doing this. But yeah, so my advisor, Jessica Dempsey of the geography department, had previously completed this really interesting study which demonstrated how environmental impact assessment processes were failing to weed out projects that inflicted direct harm on caribou populations. So taking inspiration from her work, one of my dear friends and fellow geographers, Audrey Irvine-Broke, and I decided that we would use GIS, or mapping software, for those of you who are not familiar, to try and draw out concrete connections between caribou declines and fossil fuel subsidies. If you follow BC politics at all, you might be aware that fossil fuel subsidies are a pretty hot button issue for the province right now and for the past few years. Yeah. So what we did to do this was we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the provincial government to get them to give us disaggregated subsidy data on BC's 2 largest royalty credit programs. So super basically, royalty credit programs are a form of subsidy. But more specifically, how they work is that the oil and gas companies are supposed to pay the province money, like almost like rent, to extract from different sorts of public lands. If they are granted these credits, they do not have to pay that rent, pretty much. And so the logic there is that there's supposedly supposed to be some kind of public benefit down the road from them, developing. That's a whole nother issue of whether benefits trickle down from extractive industry. Rarely materializes, but story for another time. So anyway, if you have never submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, it's this really fun process where you ask the government to give you information that you're entitled to, and then they stall, and then you send them a series of polite but assertive emails until they give you what you want, which they did, which is great. They don't always. So we got that data, and the data we got was a whole list of royalty credits with the names of the companies that got them. We were really excited to get this. And after a few months of data work, what we found out was that there were 3,000 active oil and gas wells in what the federal government calls critical caribou habitat. Critical habitat is this designation under the Species at Risk Act. It's classified as habitat that is essential to caribou survival and reproduction. So this is just a little screen grab of one of our maps. All those orange dots are wells. The lavender, it looks more white, is boreal critical caribou habitat. So clear intersections here. Great. So we figured out that there were a whole bunch of wells there. More importantly, we found out that about 1,600 of these wells are run by operators that receive one or both of BC's largest oil and gas subsidies. This is really significant for a number of reasons, but the angle that we took for this project was that this is extremely contradictory public spending, right? So BC has spent over $27 million on caribou recovery efforts over the past 3 years, but at the same time gave out almost $100 million in royalty credits to fossil fuel companies that are actually developing caribou habitat. This is a problem. So just to quickly go to the maps, we have the same sort of set of active wells. The blue ones, the operator was eligible for the deep well royalty credit, which is BC's largest oil and gas subsidy, essentially. So clearly some overlaps there. So Audrey and I, in looking at all of this, we felt like it pretty much blew a big giant hole in the province's claim that it was committed to caribou recovery and to upholding First Nations treaty rights. And this is all beside the implications of fossil fuel subsidies for climate too. Totally different thing. We had, in fact, designed this project to be public facing. So we brought it in October to our department press person, emailed a few people. She told us not to expect much because we were master's students. It hadn't been peer reviewed, but we thought it was interesting, and we did not expect much. And then on October 6th, I woke up to this, and yes, I did enjoy making this slide. And Audrey and I got to experience really the unique combination of horror and glee that comes with a ton of people seeing a project that you did not think would see the light of day. So, yeah, it was terrifying, but people were really mad, and they weren't mad at us. They were mad at what our project showed. They were mad about the contradictory spending, the failure to uphold responsibility to First Nations, and so on. Even the Reddit comments on our article links were angry in a positive way, and I feel like that's when you know that something's happening. And so I hadn't really fully been super on board with the idea of my thesis being related to this. This project happened, and I was all in, because something was happening here. And it was interesting. So one of the things that really seemed to resonate about why people were so mad was that, in theory, this habitat should be protected. It's been apparent that habitat protection is the only way to prevent caribou extirpation here in the province. And it's hard to emphasize to what extent that's like common knowledge. That is a known thing. The federal government thinks it should be protected. And our project showed that not only is this not happening, but the province is actually incentivizing development in these areas. So why isn't habitat protection happening? There's a clue in the answer that the Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Low Carbon Innovation gave when asked by reporters about our project. So their quote was, "The province is working with First Nations, local government, industry, and stakeholders," I don't know who the stakeholders are, but it's fine, "to identify acceptable outcomes for caribou recovery as well as continued resource development in BC." The key phrase here is the "as well as," if you couldn't tell from my clever highlighting. So habitat protection, because caribou habitat is also oil and gas habitat, is not a solution that ensures the survival of both caribou and the fossil fuel industry. Which brings us to something that is. So welcome to BC's wolf cull, otherwise known as the Provincial Predator Reduction Plan. If you're at all versed in the world of caribou or really just wildlife conservation in the province, you'll know that the primary state strategy of dealing with caribou declines for the past 5 years has been predator reduction. What this entails, it's just wild, is wildlife officials going up in privately contracted helicopters and shooting wolves from the helicopters. This is the conservation strategy. And so it's estimated that this process has removed over 1,500 wolves since its inception. And just in the winter of 2019 and 2020 alone, it ran up a price tag of over $2 million. So the reasoning behind this practice of taking out wolves is that wolf predation on caribou over the past 2 decades has skyrocketed. Caribou are not wolves' primary prey, so this is unusual, as has the number of wolves. So this practice then really appeals to something called equilibrium ecology, meaning that the ratio of predators to prey is out of whack and we need to do something to restore it. We can see an appeal to this sort of ecology in the BC Oil and Gas Commission's statement about caribou recovery on their website. So I'll go ahead and read that. Caribou have roamed British Columbia for thousands of years. Over the last 30 years, many caribou herds have become threatened. I love the passive voice there. It's really good use. The main threat is high predation from bears, wolves, and cougars that is out of balance from the natural cycle. Factors that contribute to this include natural events such as forest fires and human activity such as mining, logging, oil, and gas. Okay. So clearly here we can see this idea that wolves are killing caribou because some sort of ecological ratio is out of balance. But why is it out of balance? This is a fairly chaotic diagram, so it looked cool. You know when it like looks cool on a small screen? I was worried about this. It's fine. So this diagram outlines the ecology of the situation here. In the simplest terms, there are two distinct things happening. The first is that oil and gas development creates things that are known in conservation lingo as linear features. These are roads, well pad clearings, and most importantly, something called seismic lines. Seismic lines are oil and gas exploration lines, so they're like 2 meters wide. The companies cut them like up to 1 kilometer long, and they're for different sorts of resource sensing. So once these sorts of linear features are cut, they slowly regenerate, and that regeneration includes little tender baby trees and really tasty little shoots and forage that are ideal food for moose and elk, wolves' actual favorite food, primary prey. So as moose and elk grow in numbers because of the increased food, so do wolves. So oil and gas development equals more wolves. These linear features, though, specifically seismic lines, also give wolves greater access to caribou. Caribou are typically really secretive. They rely on hiding. They're not as fast as other related animals. And so there's abundant evidence of wolves using these seismic lines to see and hunt caribou. They'll run up and down them. If caribou cross them, they can see them more easily. Yeah. So as we can see here, oil and gas development, along with other industrial disturbance, is what facilitates increased wolf predation in the first place, or this sort of out of balance relationship. And if we go back, super quick. That's a seismic line. So this was taken by the Caribou Monitoring Unit up in Alberta, and there's so many pictures of them just hanging out on these, because why wouldn't they? I'm not a wolf, but it sounds like a good deal. So I'm not going to get super deep into the numbers, but the bottom line really is that culling wolves is not going to save caribou. Some herds have shown kind of marginal improvement, but this is more likely due to really intensive maternal penning operations run by a few different First Nations. So really what this entails is they capture pregnant mothers, put them in a pen until they have their calves, and then release them all together. This helps a little bit if it's paired with wolf culling, but there's been a lot of really unfortunate anecdotal instances of releasing these penned-in mothers and calves and them immediately being preyed on by wolves who are smart enough to wait outside these pens. So wolf culling, it's not a permanent solution, and this is a known reality. I'm not just saying this, we've talked to people, this is a well-known kind of thing. Conservation biologists know it, government officials know it, and the oil and gas industry definitely knows it. Everyone knows that killing wolves is not going to save caribou. So what is it then? The wolf cull is sort of what is typically known as a stopgap conservation measure. So it's pretty much short-term life support for a species. And so that's what the wolf cull is for caribou. So how is this happening is the question. If the province is committed to saving caribou, which they are, they say this all the time, and they actually are legally obligated to under First Nations treaty rights. So if they are committed to that, how has an incredibly expensive, controversial, and ineffective solution persisted when the actual answer to the problem is known and in reach? At this point, you may be thinking, Adriana, I don't know what rock you're living under, but the government does expensive, ineffective, and controversial things all the time. And to that, I say, yes, you are right. I'm American, I get it. But simply attributing this sort of failure to a lack of political will does not do justice to the variety of structural forces at play here. And also, it's no fun. So if you'll forgive this really crudely drawn diagram, I'm going to talk about what I think is happening here. And I am not the only one who thinks this. This is like a thing in political ecology. So what has happened, I argue, is that the cull has been deemed the rational or common sense solution to caribou decline, despite the fact that wolves are not the direct driver of decline, but are, no, that didn't come out right, but are in fact enabled by the real driver, oil and gas development. So the material answer to how the wolf cull has persisted as a solution probably has to do with the distribution of public funds and a lot of lobbying. But the ideological one has to do with the fact that the wolf cull matches the goals of the political economic system which sustains it, which in this case is a fossil economy. And by that, I just mean an economy dominated by sort of petro-resource extraction. So my crudely drawn diagram indicates how I think this works. So here you have the political economic context, which is the fossil economy, and it sort of illuminates a variety of different conservation solutions. Only solutions that actually sustain the political economic context, here it's extraction, are contained within the illuminated area. Solutions like habitat protection, which contradict continued extraction, are actually outside the realm of possibility or imagination. So in a political economic context of fossil fuels here, only certain conservation solutions are actually imagined as possible. And here so seismic line restoration is pretty much, they just take giant piles of dirt and dump them on seismic lines. And it sounds kind of weird, but it works really well and it's really cheap. And so this has been thought of as maybe a potential solution, but it's on the border here because seismic line restoration, while it is possible and wouldn't prevent future extraction, it still acknowledges oil and gas development as the primary driver. It's not a scapegoat solution. It acknowledges what's happening. So in this way, I'm arguing, the wolf cull actually works to sustain oil and gas extraction in the province by prolonging caribou survival and leaving the status quo unchallenged. This is kind of a habit both way solution, right? Caribou get to live a little bit longer and kind of assuage these various commitments that the province has made, but the solution itself is not challenging any of the drivers in the first place. All right, I'm going to speed it up here a little bit. So this process through which the state deems certain solutions possible based on their orientation under the dominant political economic context is also closely related to the production of scientific knowledge about conservation as a whole. So, right, the cull is a policy solution, but it is also a scientific one. Well, the last year or so has seen the tide turn a little bit. For a while, the wolf cull was the dominant peer-reviewed and approved management technique for saving caribou. This is really closely tied to a series of ideas in the realm of political ecology and science studies, which maintain that political and economic framings are actually woven into both the formulation of scientific explanations of environmental problems and the solutions proposed to reduce them. In other words, we need to challenge and interrogate the conditions of production that underlie conservation solutions in the same way that we might challenge, say, funding streams in the pharmaceutical industry and conflict of interest there, or that's how it was once explained to me, and that made a lot of sense. So we need to look closely at the political economic context and how it works to produce conservation science itself, including the questions investigated, the beneficiaries of science, and the principles of vision and division within which natural scientists think. So the question then is, under what conditions are solutions to biodiversity loss that actually challenge the underlying drivers of, possible? In what context are they possible, is the question. So these are two really interesting sort of diagrams taken from an article written by Rebecca Lave, who is a critical physical geographer, which is, you like Rebecca? She's great. So this is a linear model of knowledge transmission. So this is how we sort of typically think about scientific knowledge and the process by which it becomes known. Right, so it's produced by scientists, it's circulated, and then it's applied by a whole bunch of people. But sort of what I'm arguing, and a lot of other people argue, is more along the lines of something called a science regime, which is that knowledge is produced by a variety of actors, circulated in a very reciprocal manner, and is constantly subject to state and market forces at every step of production. Right? So this linear model doesn't even say anything about state and market forces. Science doesn't happen in a vacuum, specifically conservation science. So going back to this question of under what conditions are solutions that actually challenge extraction possible, that's probably not a question that I'm going to answer here. I'll get back to you maybe when my thesis is done. But what we are getting into here is a discussion of why this sort of analysis is important. We've established that the wolf cull is a form of stopgap ecological solution that emerges when the state discursively commits to conservation, makes a whole bunch of commitments, is legally obligated, but is materially invested in extraction, right? BC is still all in on oil and gas. This is really important, mainly because the theory, at least in political ecology, is that conservation solutions which fail to tackle underlying drivers externalize that regulation to other places. So to here it's wolves, right? The regulation that should be applied to oil and gas is externalized to wolves. So, and the regulation being applied to wolves, and I think it is notable, is indeed lethal. So identifying these stopgap solutions for what they are helps to identify the potential injustices that may be externalized. And as sort of the twin crises of ecology and environment, as Jason Moore, who's another sociologist, geographer person, puts it, as these crises intensify, so too will efforts to manage biodiversity loss. And the wolf cull is the kind of solution that we need to be willing to think about and to interrogate. In BC, we can see this intensification happening with the fishing industry calling for a provincial pinniped cull. Pinnipeds are seals and sea lions. The idea behind that is that by taking out seals and sea lions, we could prevent the ongoing declines of the hugely economically important salmon populations here in Canada. This is, of course, notwithstanding the fact that salmon declines are mainly tied to pollution, overfishing, and habitat disturbance. So I hope that sounds familiar to what we just talked about. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up here with 2 more slides. Okay, so if after all of this, you're like, Adriana, this is great great talk, but I really just don't care about caribou or solutions for biodiversity loss. First, rude. Second, you should care about this. Not because I want to force you to care about sort of more than human interaction and the environment, but because this points to a much more fundamental question about how the state governs under capitalism. This is not just about corporate power. It's quite literally about the limits to what the state can do when it comes to protecting what we might call nature. Tensions over caribou declines and the inability of BC to address the issue relates directly to what political economist James O'Connor and others have termed the second contradiction of capitalism, right? So the idea is that the growth of capitalism relies on extraction that eventually degrades, the resources to the point where they are unextractable. So capitalism eventually eats away at its own base. And the way that my advisor puts this, and I think it's really sort of a potent phrasing of it, in an article that she published with some other geographers in 2019, she writes, the state's legitimacy rests on fulfilling these dual obligations. So we have the dual obligations here. The state is the developer and protector in chief. It must develop resources for growth and at the same time protect them from degradation that will undermine the system itself. So the dual obligations. The state's legitimacy rests on fulfilling these dual obligations, enabling development that supplies jobs and resource rents while also protecting its citizens and natures against the destruction that development engenders. The wolf cull is a solution that emerges directly from the state attempting unsuccessfully to fulfill these dual obligations. There are therefore limits to how long the state can be in these two dual roles at once. And caribou decline and the failure to remediate it is a really, really good example of when this happens, right? A middle-of-the-road solution is not going to fix this, and instead it's making things worse. So this is a really great picture of two caribou taken by Chris Johnson, who's a caribou researcher up at the University of Northern British Columbia. We use it in our project. I really like it, and it's a good one to end on. So the fate of caribou in BC is really uncertain, and at this point is quite grim. So this is for many groups in BC, not in DC, especially First Nations. For them, this is really inconceivable. So the story then of BC's woodland caribou is one of biodiversity loss and policy failure, but it's also one that really should provoke us to try to better interrogate and understand the different forces that structure conservation policy and how we attempt to intervene in these different issues. And yeah, that's it. I think, yeah, Steve has the microphone.
Thanks, Adriana. That was great.
Yeah.
Aisha.
That was super great. You're an excellent presenter, first of all. Thank you for making that so understandable for someone who knows nothing about caribou. I'm
just going to get this back up.
Yeah.
You can totally ask.
So I have a question that sort of stems out of, you mentioned that you're using STS, science studies literature to,
yeah.
And that's Rebecca Leif pulls from that kind of stuff as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was reminded in your presentation, I think specifically because of your discussion about the role of the fossil fuel industry here, of Naomi Oreskes' work. And I don't know, there's been some criticism about thinking of bad faith actors or merchants of doubt as a primary driver in, complicating policy of this nature. But I think, with the fossil fuel industry and with, the tobacco industry, it's been a compelling argument that's been made. So the first part of that question is there something to be said about thinking about them as explicitly as bad faith actors?
Yes.
And and then, of course, with all of the discussions going around with about the pipelines in Canada, the sort of, people being arrested, people being sent to court, what role these industries play in the running of governments and the making of their policies. But also, secondly, as a related question, you brought up basically that wolf culling was the dominant, strain of research that was happening for some time. And I'd be curious to know, just from your own reading, who's writing it and where are they from? Also, does the fossil fuel industry do much research production? Because they sort of, there's these think tanks that have played a really important role in influencing and creating certain kinds of rhetorics about, doubt about climate change and things like that in other aspects, right, of that kind of research. So I don't know if those are my questions. I'm curious to know what you found.
Those are really, really good questions. The bad faith actors point is a really good one. So I went a little bit heavy-handed in this talk, because I was giving a talk, but I actually don't really buy into bad faith arguments. There are certainly bad actors, but kind of the way that I talk about it with other members of my research group and the way that my advisor puts it is no one walks into their job at an oil and gas company and sits down and is like, I'm gonna go kill some caribou today. It's not a thing that happens. And so for me, it's not so much this bad bad faith scheming to do these things and to maintain profit and all this stuff. It's simply the fact that the state thinks the mainstream narrative is that the state depends on this revenue, right? So it's kind of more so for me about different kinds of entrenched power and how they consciously and unconsciously try to reproduce themselves, if that makes sense. And I think there is especially with the fossil fuel industry, there definitely is a little bit of that bad actor situation.
I want to maybe push this in a little bit of a different direction.
Yeah,
I absolutely agree with the characterization that, perhaps they're not coming into work thinking in that way, but what if we, this is why I mentioned the fossil fuel industry's presence and influence in the government, I think, is perhaps a form of bad faith acting.
Yes.
Because their interests are weighted quite heavily towards these industries.
Right.
With the knowledge, of course, of the environmental problems that come about as a direct result of them, often in these scientifically indisputable ways, yet economic forces prevail. So I meant more in that sense rather than, the sort of more Foucauldian position of nobody's acting in this coercive puppet master sort of way.
Yeah.
But rather, there is I don't know, I would say there seems to be some sort of obvious awareness of what it means to have these funds for caribou conservation, and as you pointed out in your research, this huge subsidies for these organizations to come and do this kind of work in the same area. And I don't know, what is that in your mind? What does it say about the kind of values that play a role in conservation science? Especially when it's let's talk about wolf culling as a major solution variety.
Yeah. So it's difficult. I'm reticent to conservation scientists do so much work that I could never do. So I'm always reticent to sort of criticize individual sort of efforts in that sense. But what I will say is that, the conservation science that has come out supporting the wolf cull is of a very specific variety. It is white, it is settler, it is coming from a very specific angle, and really the folks that have been advocating this whole time for habitat protection, and now that's really making its way into mainstream literature, we're not necessarily in those circles. And with regard to kind of how the oil and gas industry plays a role in these kinds of funding, or not funding, of research, yes, they absolutely fund a ton of this research. But what's fascinating is that they fund research that then comes out and directly contradicts what it says. It doesn't say what they want it to say. And that's part of the puzzle too. So is it about like influence? Is it, it's not like, right, we kind of imagine that if a corporation is funding research, it's in kind of how this happened with, smoking, at least in the US, and with some early sort of climate change stuff, that it comes out directly in support of that corporation. And that's not how it's worked here. I was reading an article like 2 weeks ago that was pretty much about how caribou will go way out of their way to avoid well sites, like almost a kilometer out of their way, which is really bad. It pushes them into sorts of environments they may not be familiar with, high stress, all these different things. And I get to the bottom, and it's funded by the like Alberta Tar Sands Foundation, or that's not a real foundation, but like something very, very similar to that. And so I feel like I don't actually have a good answer to your provocations, which are really, really insightful, I think.
I'm sorry. I'll just make a last point really quickly. I thought it was really, I'm so glad you said that, because there was a point you had from like the comment that the fossil fuel industry was making, and it was like, it's the like sort of the wildlife culling, like the too many predators, as well as human activities, such as whatever. So in some sense, I wonder if it's like the impetus to create a reasonable other possibility in the form of predators that allows you to kind of take some of the attention off of like, maybe it's like too late to be saying that human activities don't contribute to it. So I wonder if there's like a balancing act happening. But thank you for that. That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I have two questions. The first one being, I have negative knowledge about economics. So if you wouldn't mind like explaining what subsidies like is a bit further, and then how does the royal credit play into that? That would be really helpful.
Yeah.
And then I'll ask my second question after you answer the first.
Excellent. Great question. So a subsidy, as defined by the World Trade Organization, is any benefit conferred by a government, by a government to industry. So royalty credits, after our whole project came out, there is this guy who has written 3 letters to the editor to a regional newspaper in BC about how me and my collaborators have no idea what a subsidy actually means. He's arguing, this is a random dude. He's arguing that a royalty credit is not a subsidy because the government is not actually paying industry. But the bottom line is, the way we can look at it, royalty credits, royalties are rent. And a royalty credit is foregone rent. And actually, BC views it as a deficit. So there is a little bit of like hair splitting over what a subsidy is and if we can actually call royalty credits subsidies. And part of that is related to this whole ongoing debate between the US and BC about if BC's lumber industry is subsidized. And that's like a whole mess. But the bottom line is that our stance is that royalty credits are subsidies because they are a benefit conferred to the oil and gas industry, and a very clear benefit. This incentivizes development that would not be happening. Oil and gas extraction is becoming increasingly uneconomic. So there's uneconomic development happening because you're getting, as a company, $5 million in credits that you then don't have to pay to the government. Yes.
Okay, so that was super helpful. So effectively, like, they're not, nope, not even gonna try to it made sense, so thank you. Okay, so second question is, and you briefly touched upon this in your talk, but I would love to know more if there is, since wolf culling is very much like a Band-Aid that is going to fall off at some point, what do you foresee that potential timeline being? And then feel free to just completely avoid that question. Once that hits, do you think that furthers that illuminated realm of possibility in finally acknowledging, okay, well, maybe this is not actually going to work when we have to.
Yeah.
We're now forced to acknowledge these other options.
Great question. So that's a really good question, and it's part of why this issue is so intriguing. BC took a survey that asked, what the public thought about the wolf cull. And the responses were overwhelmingly negative. 65% of people strongly disagreed with the wolf cull as a solution. They had us rank different preferences. The top three were habitat protection, like incorporating indigenous, traditional ecological knowledge, so indigenous knowledge, and some other sort of habitat-related thing. So they did that survey, and 3 weeks ago, the government came out and said, here's the survey, we are renewing the wolf cull for 5 more years. But that's wild, and that's part of this. How is this happening? So that is a really good question. So I don't know when the Band-Aid is going to fall off. Unfortunately, with this, I think a lot of people had a good amount of hope kind of pinned on this survey, and it didn't happen. So at this point, it's kind of like, is the wolf cull just going to keep happening until these herds continue to wink out? And that kind of does seem to be the case right now. There is a little bit more hope in the realm of the sort of calls for a just transition, moving away from oil and gas, but these seismic lines, they take like 20 years to fully regenerate to the point that they're... Caribou rely on old growth, which is also part of the context here. But yeah, so I don't know.
Okay.
That's what's happening.
In a slightly related question,
Yeah.
you mentioned at one point how you could do this, was it seismic line kind of or protection or regeneration where you put kind of dirt on it? And I imagine there are kind of a number of things you can do like that and similar stuff that you could do, and it's just that kind of the oil and gas industry doesn't want to pay to do those things, or they don't want the bad PR from doing those things. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering kind of, do you think that if all these things were done, like you could do resource extraction and protect the caribou? Mm. And if so, kind of how much more expensive would it be to do that? And if it is just kind of like, say, it's like 50% more expensive or something, why we're not in a situation where those things just are done as default? Because I thought that it was interesting, the kind of protector and, I can't quite remember the nice phrasing, but protector and kind of developer. Mm-hmm. And it seems like those things don't necessarily need to be incompatible, but they do need to be balanced. Yeah. And it seems like here we've got this thing where the developer/extractor is got an awful lot of lobby pressure, and so it's really kind of that's being prioritized, and it's creating this kind of distorted narrative. Right. And I just wondered if you thought they could coexist, or...
So what also makes this really interesting, and that's a very good question, is could there be continued really limited development of oil and gas reserves and some sort of protection of caribou? Yes. Theoretically, I think, right, that northern population they're declining, but it's still pretty robust. The southern mountain and the boreal are they're on their way down. And so what makes this really interesting is caribou, I was telling this to Isaac earlier, are incredibly sensitive. When we talk about them as a species, they're almost entirely incompatible with any form of industrial development, which is really unfortunate, but makes them a super interesting case study with stuff like this. Because in this way, they're sort of this canary in the coal mine, right, of how industrial development is impacting biodiversity. But yeah, I mean, I'm not like a wildlife conservation biologist, but yes, I think that if BC significantly ramped down new development, they probably could sustain some kind of coexistence, perhaps. Do I think that will happen? Probably not, only because in doing this report, Audrey was like the main sort of econ subsidy person, but we pulled up BC's projections for petroleum and natural gas production over the next 25 years. And if you haven't looked at them, you should, because it's horrifying, like doubling production. So I only say that I don't necessarily see that, because I'm not sure how you double production and simultaneously ramp down new development.
Do you think that on some level of government, they're kind of aware of that, and they're just kind of cynically saying, okay, we're just going to, as you said, assuage, and then quietly the caribou will die out, and we say, oh, but we're killing so many wolves, we're really trying hard, guys, kind of thing?
Yes. I kind of, yes, I kind of think that's what's happening, but at the same time, me saying that does a good deal of injustice to the many, many people and government, right? I use the term government in my talk. There's no way to encapsulate the entirety of the provincial government as one entity. There's a variety of people who have different sort of thoughts, but in talking to bureaucrats, right, there's only so much they can do. So they can know that habitat protection is the only way to go forward, but at the same time, it's part of this too is trying to understand how a very large governing apparatus makes decisions, and who has power and who doesn't, and what kind of knowledge counts and what kind of knowledge does not count. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I think you
Okay.
very much did.
Cool.
And I have to say, I think it's great to kind of do freedom of information requests and all of that, and this kind of investigative kind of science journalism stuff is like really key to like, I don't know, making
It's
sure
really
government doesn't get
thrilling.
too distorted kind of thing. And
Yeah.
So I think that's great. It seems really depressing that they're not doing the seismic line regeneration, because that just seems like a PR cost. Like, they should acknowledge that. Do you have any comment on that?
I do think they're going to start to in some of the worse off areas. So like the southern mountain my map's not coming up again, but the southern mountain region, I would not be surprised if they start doing that in certain like really high risk areas. I think because it's cheap. You just dump a bunch of dirt on the ground.
And thank you again. It's
Yeah.
really great.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Oh no. Let's try this. I'll try to be as concise as possible. But I really enjoyed your talk. As someone who's like involved in the BC NDP for a bit, so I'm like, oh my god. I know with like your diagram, you talked a lot about like the political economic context and different folks throughout the course of. Oh, sorry. There's a right over here. They talked about like different things in terms of like what would it take, or like what sort of like exogenous shocks would take in order for the political economic context to shift in such a way that like particular policy solutions or scientific solutions would become feasible.
Yeah.
And I guess I know you talked about like the survey and how that sort of almost did something, or in terms of like other folks were talking about like is it going to take habitat collapse and the fact that like liquid natural gas and all these other things are like polluting water tables. Or other sort of stakeholder, well, no, sorry, let's say rights holders, like indigenous groups seeking treaty claims. So I guess my question is like, in terms of like the research that you're doing at the moment, are there some like potential exogenous shocks that might shift that context in such a way that like, policy solutions, you know, things other than the wolf?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. I have meetings about this with my advisor, and we work with a public economist who's seen a lot of stuff. And I am not a BC resident. I didn't grow. So sometimes I feel weird, like injecting myself into what I think of the province. But we do sense a change. I think there's something happening. And where I see that is with this subsidy stuff. So Audrey and I kind of timed it to go with the province had planned this review of their royalty system, and which happened, 2 weeks after we released this report, and a lot of other NGOs and stuff had released different things. And in November, the province commissioned another survey about the oil and gas royalty credit programs. And it was the kind of thing where you like write an essay and send it to them. And the minister of low carbon, energy, mines, and low carbon innovation pretty much came out and said, we hear you, this is broken. It's been broken for 30 years and we're not sure why we haven't fixed it. And to me, that means something. It's yet to be seen what kind of new system they will adopt, but I sense something, and I am not quite sure what that something is. It's not happening with the wolf cull, but I think also there's a lot of pressure from First Nations. I don't know if people are familiar with the Blueberry Lake ruling, but First Nation up in sort of central BC, they brought a case to the BC Supreme Court that pretty much said oil and gas companies are developing on our land to an extent, I forget what the exact argument was, but it's pretty much oil and gas companies are destroying our land. We have legal reason to block any further resource extraction on our traditional territory. And the judge there agreed with them. There's a moratorium on any further development there, and that was huge. And a lot of, so one of my collaborators is with the West Moberly, and they're kind of riding on like the coattails of this decision. They're really trying to build some momentum. And what that ruling was based on was something called cumulative impact. So what they did was sort of prove that there's, right, like 16% of BC is deforested, and it's something like, I don't want to actually throw out a number because I don't know it, a much higher percentage of Blueberry Lakes territory was deforested than the rest of BC. So it's kind of in these smaller challenges that I see something coming, and I do think also that climate change, it's taken a while, but I do see something happening with these different emergencies and sort of momentum for something. Will it be a just transition? I don't know. But yeah, that's a good question too. Yeah.
Yes, I think, thank you. I think there could be a major breakthrough or major change societal and energy-wise for our world society in the next 20 years or in the next 30 years because of nuclear fusion. Oh. And last week, for example, we had a huge breakthrough and scientists reported in BBC and New York Times about this. And I also worked at the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics, so I know some stuff about this also and which projects are going on. For example, ITER being built in France, and the next one is DEMO, which will be the first one which actually yields energy for villages. And DEMO will be ready 2055, so hopefully with the pandemic, but maybe 2060. So as a movie in your mind also, this would be it seems like it's a huge, or gas and oil companies have a huge influence, and are kind of the major part of your whole presentation, right? This would be totally different then, when this comes up. And what do you think, how flexible is government? How flexible are companies? How flexible are the people, society as a whole? When this comes up, are they kind of jumpy? So jumping around to other solutions which are just very obvious to them, or are they thinking deeper? Do they have some vacuum empty for possible new scientific breakthroughs and new solutions, new options? So not rigid in the thinking, but just having a picture in your mind because you thought about this so long. What do you think may happen then in the next 20 years if you think deeply about it? So not just the first thought.
Yeah, I mean, specifically with regard to how companies and different technologies are going to respond to these sort of crises. The critical social scientist in me would like to say that capitalism reproduces itself. So it's not so much about oil and gas as it is about finding new ways to kind of sustain extraction. Right, so you see with Shell, Shell is traditionally an oil company. It is now, the Shell commercials are getting crazier and crazier. I don't know if you've seen any of them lately, but they're like bright green and everyone's like wearing linen and is, it's the ability of these powerful actors to latch on to solutions which might be really hopeful is, I think, something that's still worth interrogating. So even if we have this sort of, did you say nuclear fusion?
Yes,
Fusion?
yes.
Right. So that is an amazing possibility that could alleviate a lot of different energy pressures. But at the same time, for me, it's also about power. And sort of how decisions are made about those solutions, who gets to implement them, all of these different things. Are you asking about like my ideal movie, like narrative?
Not ideal,
No.
but what do you think is possible? Because you have you have more ideas than all of us, I think, together, because you're in that topic and this is your research.
Yeah, I think there's a lot possible. I really do have a good amount of hope for some kind of just energy transition.
The thing is, nuclear fusion yields so much energy like nothing we had ever before on this planet. So that means all the oil companies, all the gas companies would be, if there's a collective agreement among countries, will be bankrupt. Totally. Just there's no solution because it's not compatible. Nuclear fusion is not compatible with oil and gas because it's completely goes then to nuclear fusion because these huge reactors are being built with a purpose.
Right. I mean, but there's also so many like amazing possibilities that governments don't embrace or agree on because they are like bolstered by existing modes of production, right? So we could wind and solar power and hydropower energy, we could power, the US could power itself on all of these things and it hasn't, which is part of my concern, right? Even this like super amazing technology which could generate tons of energy and solve all these problems, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. And I understand that that's like somewhat cynical, but that's kind of the angle I come from with regard to different sorts of like energy and resource use. And I tend to just focus on like basic renewable energy transition because we haven't even been able to do that yet. And so hopefully when, 2055 comes around, or 2060, there will be some kind of agreement that we can do that, whoever we is, but yeah, that's kind of my thought.
Sure. I don't know, but it seems like the pandemic is a huge disruption of everything.
The pandemic?
Yes. No, like the pandemic. So maybe we don't even have an agreement now. Maybe it will form. But these are maybes. That is true. But it's nice. It's nice that there could be some solution. Yeah.
Yes,
Great.
for sure.
Mine is not a question. I just wanted to comment on something because I'm from Japan, and Japan experienced, the explosion of the nuclear power plant.
Right.
And yes, as a physicist, yes, nuclear fission is promising, and yet they haven't implemented proper safety, protocols and everything. And obviously, even if they think yes, we have put enough safety protocols, you don't know what's going to happen. And nuclear fusion, if it gets out of the reactor, what's going to happen? And I saw the ghost towns because of the explosion. So there are a lot of safety concerns around it. Even if those countries are hopeful enough and they are progressive enough to take on those things, that there would be significant opposition from countries that like Ukraine, like Japan, that actually experience the horrifying thing about nuclear fusion. And also, environmentalists will also be really concerned about it. So one solution doesn't necessarily mean that it will be gladly taken by most countries. So I just wanted to point that out.
I'll link to the last one if no one else has. Okay, so this is actually just another clarifying question because my brain. But you mentioned that the BC government is legally obligated to protect these resources. But what is the legal recourse? And is it really just going to the Supreme Court again at the behest of Indigenous communities saying, no, you can't do this anymore? Is there really legal recourse to it?
Yes. So and I am not going to do this justice because I'm not super versed in the legal setup of it all. But in my understanding, so under treaty rights, which are these historic agreements that First Nations have with the settler government, the province is obligated to uphold and protect certain opportunities for First Nations. One of these is being able to hunt traditional sources of food and cultural sustenance, and caribou are one of those. So the best way to describe it, in my understanding, and I may be incorrect about certain aspects of this, but the BC government is obligated to sustain caribou populations to the extent that First Nations can hunt them. Or that is the idea. It has not, to my knowledge, been successfully challenged in court to that extent. But something else that I'll add that's really interesting is there are a bunch, so there's a whole other facet to the wolf cull that's super, I don't mean this disparagingly, it's super PETA, right? There's a whole rejection of the wolf cull based on animal ethics. And it's really an entirely different sort of opposition to it. That's not really based around extraction. It's more so based on that this is an ethically unsavory practice, which I do agree with to a certain extent. Where was I going with that? Yes, so there is a current legal challenge about the actual legality of culling wolves under BC Wildlife Code. So that's an interesting avenue, and it's progressed. It was put in by this organization called Pacific Wild. And it has made it through, not to the Supreme Court, but to an appeals court, I think. I think that's what that is? A higher level court, but so that's also like an interesting legal avenue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again, Adriana. Awesome. It's like impressive at packed house on Valentine's
thank you
overtime.
for coming, everyone.
Well done, everyone.
For spending your Valentine's Day with me. Valentine's night.